Hello everyone. In this video I will be talking about this monster that I've created. I will be showing you a little bit of detail about how I've sculpted it, and I will go into more detail on how I painted it and how I've made the base. So I hope you enjoy, and let's get right to it. I've named this monster the Observer because in my imagination it is a monster that takes its time tracking its target, trying to find out as much information as it can to get an advantage. I am planning to run it in a Dungeons and Dragons campaign, so I also wrote up its stats. You can find these in the description below. Here you can see the initial concept art that I made before starting on the model. The idea I had was a masked creature with the body of a snake and insect legs. I found this concept art a little bit too heavy, so for the model I decided to make its body more slender. I also found the mask to be too skull-like, so I changed this as well. I sculpted this miniature using green stuff around the metal armature. Green stuff is a two-component modeling putty that sets when you mix the two parts. One part is yellow, one part is blue, and when you mix them it becomes green. I really like it because it holds a lot of detail, and on this scale I feel like it's necessary to have this detail. As you can see, I started out making the miniature in different parts with joints to put them together. I did this because I initially planned on making silicone molds so that I could make recasts. One goal I have is to make my own garage kits so other people can paint my miniatures as well. Unfortunately, I don't have any video of me sculpting, but if people like this video, I might make another one in the future. Here you can see I glued the different pieces together and primed everything black. The first thing I do then is to apply a base color on the model. I wanted the miniature to have a dark and moody atmosphere, so I decided to paint it in a dark blue. Theoretically, the mask is white, but for the base coat I went for a bluish gray. This blue undertone will make the mask and the body work better together once the monster is done. Next to me you can see a reference picture that I'm using for the colors. I like to find some images that give me a guideline while painting, and the Dungeons and Dragons monster manual gives me a lot of them. Also, seeing a creature or an object that has the color I'm painting gives me a good idea for the color of my shadows and highlights later on in the project. The miniature is clamped into a holder so that I can easily reach every part of the monster without having to touch it. Otherwise I would be touching wet paint and possibly breaking off legs. I made this holder myself. It's just two pieces of wood that I can open and close with the black knob. For this miniature I had to drill two holes in its belly and attach two pieces of metal wire that I could then clamp into the holder. The palette I'm using is a wet palette. This basically is a flat box with a moist sponge, on top of which is a special type of paper that lets a little bit of moisture seep through. And when I put acrylic paints on it, they stay wet a lot longer than on a regular palette. And also the box is airtight, so I can keep mixed paint for up to 2 weeks. And here I'm using the blue I mixed for the body to create the bluish gray for the mask, so that it looks like they are under the same lighting. The next step is applying a black wash. The wash is like a heavily diluted paint, but it has some extra ingredients that prevent it from pooling onto surfaces. It creeps into all the little details of your model. By doing this, the shape of the monster becomes a lot clearer and it adds a shadow effect to places where there would be less light. I tend to add one or two extra layers on the bottom of the miniature and to parts that would be darker because this is just a really easy way to add some shadows. I did hear that it's possible to make your own washes, but I haven't tried it yet. I might try it in the future. The same technique is applied to the mask. Here it really brings out the details and shapes of the eye sockets and the cheekbones, for example. By doing this, it becomes a lot easier to see where you have to put your shadows and where you have to put your highlights. And that brings me to the next step, which is shading. As you have seen in the intro, I'm planning to have this monster standing in water. And to make it look like its legs are wet, I glaze them with several layers of black paint, which is slightly diluted, making them blacker at the tips. Here the wet palette really shows its value. It's really easy to add a little bit of water with a brush, where normally I would have to mix up a lot more. And the thinned down paint also dries really fast, making it a lot easier and faster to create a nice smooth transition from lighter to darker. When the shading is done, I started working on the highlights. Here I added some white to my initial blue base color and painted the parts that would be hit the most by the light. Parts like the knees, the top of the head, but also some details like the cheekbones and the tip of the tail. During the painting of this model, I went back and forth between shading and highlighting. I find it difficult to predict the way the light will fall on the monster, but correcting a shadow or highlight after I painted it is a lot easier. And because I have all my paints ready on my wet palette, I can do this really quickly. For the mask, I used a different kind of highlighting technique than I did with the body of the monster. I diluted a white paint on my palette and I put several transparent layers on the parts that I wanted highlighted. Because of this, the blue in the base color remains visible, but the mask looks like it is white in the setting that I'm making. The monster has 5 pearls on its mask and I decided to make them red. Basically, I followed the same steps as I did with the rest of the miniature. I gave the gems a base coat, I applied shading, and I finished with a highlight. After that, I did put a black wash around the gems to give them a dark contour so they would stand out more. Painting these small details is really hard to get right in one go, but it's always possible to do some touch-ups afterwards. Here I was happy with how the gems looked, but some of the red paint ended up on the mask, so I corrected it with some white paint. After going back and forth between shading and highlighting and painting the details, I reached a point where I was happy with how the monster looked, so now it was time to start with the base. I started with the base by cutting this piece of wood. It was painted from another project, so I sanded it down a little bit. I want to glue things to the wood and they will stick better to a rough surface than they will to paint. I wanted to have the monster standing in water surrounded by some rocks. I made the rocks with Sculpey modeling clay, but to save some material I used some tin foil to create the volumes. This also gave me the opportunity to move around with the volumes to find out what looks best. During painting, one of the front legs broke off, and after I glued it back in place it was a little bit too high, and instead of redoing it I thought it would be cool to have the leg out of the water and standing on one of the rocks. Here I have the two tinfoil rocks on the place where I wanted them. I then marked the outline and superglued them into place. At this point I started adding the modeling clay, and the first step was to cover the tinfoil completely. To make the transition between the clay and the wooden surface nice and smooth, I used some modeling tools. I wanted the rocks to be cracked, so now I started to add some shapes to the first layer of Sculpey. At this step in the build I'm just looking at the shape of the rocks, not to any detail or texture. This will be the next step. It is very important that the shapes are merged with the underlying modeling clay, otherwise they might come loose after the clay has been baked. To add texture to the rocks I used an actual rock. I found a nice sharp one and used it to press into the clay. I used different parts of the rock to make sure that there were no repeating textures, and the detailed texture I got with this method would have been impossible to make with regular modeling tools. And here is a close-up of the finished sculpt for the rocks. As you can see, I added an extra rock to add a little bit more to the scene. I also made sure the monster has all of its feet onto the base, because at this stage it is still easy to add or remove clay if necessary. Painting the base is similar to painting the miniature. I started with a base coat, in this case a brown gray, and added shadows and highlights. However, most of the shadows I added with different kinds of washes. For these rocks I used black, brown and a little bit of green wash. Washes are ideal to add detail to texture. In this case they get into all the cracks of the rock and add a lot of depth. After all these washes I added the highlights using the dry brushing technique. I put a little bit of light brown paint onto a big brush and immediately remove as much as I can on a kitchen paper. There will still be a little bit of almost dry paint on the brush, and I brush this onto the parts I want highlighted. This is an easy and quick way to add some depth to the scene. Now that the base has been painted, it is time to put the miniature in place and work on the water. I am using a clear resin that is used for jewelry. You basically mix two components together and you mix them really well, and the resin will then cure overnight. It is really important to prepare your casting well. If anything goes wrong during casting, it can ruin your base or even worse, your miniature. I always go through the process mentally before actually starting so that I remind myself of possible tools I might need or to prepare myself for possible mistakes. As you can see, I made a wall around the base to contain the resin, and I'm using a syringe to prevent any spills onto places I don't want the resin to end up. And here you can see what it looks like directly after casting. I was really happy with this result, but when I checked an hour later, I saw that the resin was leaking out of a gap in the walls. This was not a big problem because I could wait for the resin to cure and then try again. I was very glad that I cast it into this blue container though, because otherwise I would have had a big mess to clean up. When the resin had cured and I cleaned up the edges a little bit, I thought I was finished with this build. I shot this video and I realized that the surface of the water was way too shiny and flat. So I looked up some videos on how to create scale wave effects and I tried it for myself. I found that there are several products that you can use for this, and I went with something I could find in a local art supply shop. I bought a thick clear drying acrylic medium. Painters normally use it to make their paints thicker so that they can sculpt their paints. I use it directly out of the pot and it looked really over the top at this point, but this stuff dries transparent, so I didn't worry about that. Here you can see how it looked directly after painting the waves. I chose a direction for the waves and tried to imagine how the rocks would affect the flow of the water. I also added some extra splash effects where the waves hit the rocks or the miniature. When the medium had dried, I thinned down a white paint and started to paint the tips of the waves. The last thing I did was to add a dry brush of the complete surface of the water using a glossy white paint. And here is the result. I am very happy with how this turned out and I'm very interested in hearing what other people think about it. If you have any questions, I will gladly point you to some videos that helped me in this project. Just send me a message and I will let you know. As I said before, I really want to try and make garage kits and I will be working towards this goal in the future. If people are interested, have some tips or are interested in more videos like this, please subscribe or follow me on Instagram. And thanks a lot for watching this video and maybe see you next time.